Okay, so now we're finally getting into some grouping here. This is problem number 22. It says write a query to produce the following data set for each state. Note we're grouping by state here. We want the sum and count of invoices. Okay, so looking at this data, in Arizona, for example, we only had one invoice for the whole state, $662. California, on the other hand, we had 40 invoices for that state, upwards of $37,000. So you get a completely different look at the data when you group by a column or a group of columns. So let's take a look at the syntax here. Okay, so we're going to select the sum of the invoice total. That'll get us the first column here. We're going to call that INV total. Nice meaningful column name there. And then we'll get the count of invoices. I'll just count the invoice total as well. I'll call that num invoices. And then I'm also wanting the vendor state to show in my results. So those three elements in this select clause, okay, are going to translate to the three columns that we see here. Okay, and then this is a join actually, because the invoice data obviously comes from the invoices table, but the state, the vendor state, comes from the vendors table. So we've got two tables that have something that we want, and so we have to include them both. We were not asked to do an implicit versus explicit join here, so you can you choose whatever you want when you're not being asked for one or the other. And also, this is a join, so I do have to add a where clause and join on the common column, just like we were doing back in the join section of this exercise. But now this is where things change. We're going to group by vendor state, and this makes all the difference here when we group by vendor state. That's what causes this configuration here in the results where we're grouped by state. One thing I want to point out here is okay, this works fine, but what if I said, you know what, let's also throw the vendor city in here. Okay, I want to see not only the state, but I want to see the cities in there too. And then I go and try to run this thing, and I get an error. Okay, it says the vendor city column is invalid in the select list. This is the select list, my select clause, because it is not contained in either an aggregate function or the group by clause. Here's the thing, okay? Look at what I have in my select clause. This is an aggregate function. This is an aggregate function. And then I have two run-of-the-mill columns that I want to throw in there, vendor state and vendor city. If you have a run-of-the-mill column like vendor state or vendor city, and you're doing a grouping, you absolutely must have those columns in the group by clause. So, and I'm coming up against a wall here because vendor state is okay. He's down here, that's good. But vendor city needs to be added here too, if I want this to work. Okay, so let me run that just to see what the results look like here. Okay, there they are. The cities are included. But in any case, so getting back to that error, let me generate that error again. So vendor city, you can include it in your select clause, but unless it's an aggregate, which it's not, these guys are off the hook. They're not going to cause a problem. Aggregate functions are off the hook with regards to this type of issue. Vendor state is also okay because he's in the group by clause. But vendor city, if you want him to be okay, if you have a run-of-the-mill column that's not an aggregate and you're grouping, that run-of-the-mill column in your select clause has got to appear in the group by clause, and that's why vendor city is causing a problem. So we would have to add that. Okay, so that was a group by. Now I want to let's get into the next problem here, which is kind of related. Modify number 22 to include only data for California. Now, this is, before we dive into the syntax, I want to show you two very important sentences, and I want these to really sink in here. the where clause, which we've been looking at for a long time, even for simple queries, the where clause limits the number of rows returned in the query. Okay, so if I want, for example, I'll just grab any old query from here. Okay, like this one, but way back in number 2, we're using where to limit the number of rows returned to those balances between $100 and $200. We're limiting the number of rows. I don't want to see all of the invoices. I just want to see those that are limited to this range, okay? So we use the where clause to limit the number of rows to returned in a typical query, okay? So you all understand what that means. Now, the having clause limits the number of groups returned in a query, the number of groups returned. So when you're grouping, the having clause is going to limit the number of groups. So in this case, I am grouping, okay, but I want to modify the group data to only include data for California. So it's the same query as before. I have the sum of invoices, I have the count, I have the state. Let me get that up here so we don't lose sight of that. Okay, it's a join. We already talked about that. Got the join clause, joining on the common column, grouping by vendor state. Okay, but in this query, I'm asked to limit those groups to just California. Okay, so I'm really only going to see California in the results. But to limit those groups, I have to use a having clause. Okay, so when you're grouping and you want to limit or you want to filter, it's not a where clause like it has been in the past, all the other queries that we've done. It's having, okay? So having state of California. All right, let's see what we get for these results. And there it is, just one row because it's just one group.